John Swaddle is the faculty director of the Institute for Integrated Conservation and professor of biology at William and Mary. He received his Bachelor of Science and PhD from the University of Bristol in the UK. He's trained in behavioral and sensory ecology. He, along with his students, designed practical solutions that help to harmonize wildlife conservation with the enhanced well-being of people. He's published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles, holds several patents, has received millions of dollars in external funding. He's past president of the Animal Behavior Society, and he is also a lifetime fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the largest academic society in the world. At William & Mary, he served as the Dean of Graduate Studies and Research, Chair of the Biology Department, Director of Environmental Science and Policy Program, and co-chair of the university's Committee on Sustainability. He co-authored William & Mary's Sustainability Plan and the Climate Action Roadmap. He consults for Fortune 500 companies and regularly works with industry partners to deliver conservation solutions that also promote opportunities for economic development. Thank you, John, for being with us tonight. And let me end my sharing, and you can share yours.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you to everybody, especially to Vail for the invitation. And hopefully you can see my screen. Can you?
Thank you.
Okay, good. I see Shirley nodding. Great. So I'll jump straight to the punchline. People, humans, are part of nature, not apart from nature. And so we need to think about how, especially birds and human lives, are intimately entwined. And we can make very easy arguments for bird conservation because bird conservation helps people as well as helps the birds themselves. So what I want to talk tonight about is a couple of different case studies that describe how bird and human well-being are connected in this type of way. And I'm going to do this through a concept known as One Health. And what One Health tries to describe is the integration of human health, environmental health, and wildlife health, animal health in most cases. And the intersection point of these is described as One Health. And I'll go through two different case studies. One is thinking about birds as sentinels for human health, in this case for lead toxicity and lead poisoning. And another case of birds being buffers or protectors against infectious disease. And I'll go through a case study of West Nile virus. And this work sort of spans almost 2 decades of different student projects that I've been involved in. The first one is about lead contamination and house sparrows. So the idea here in terms of these intersecting circles of One Health is that the sparrows, the human health, and the environmental contamination in this case all intersect with each other. And we performed this study over several years in Australia led by collaborators based out of Australia, looking at lead contamination in these small mining towns in Australia. If you've ever been to Australia, especially the inner parts of Australia, it's fairly barren in most cases, and then you have these little oases of towns. And so this gives us a way of looking at independent events, in this case of ore mining, digging up minerals from the ground, and resulting in contamination of those areas. So we looked at the soil and dust contamination with lead, the amount of lead that was in the house sparrows, the animals, and house sparrows are a good study for this because, as you probably know, they're very sedentary resident birds. They live in the same area for year upon year. So we have hundreds of years of records of some house sparrows living in these towns. Well, over 100 years anyway. And also we have records of lead being tested in children because of the ore mining facility and the public health problems. So to explore this in a One Health context, we first need to see, is the lead in the house sparrows similar to the amount of lead that you would see in the environment, in this case in the soil? So this graph is showing a correlation of those two things. Soil lead across the horizontal axis at the bottom and the amount of lead in the sparrow blood up the y-axis. And what this shows is a good positive correlation across all those different sites. So when there's more soil, when there's more lead in the soil, there is more lead in the blood of these house sparrows. So environmental health and sparrow animal health are related to each other. The next thing to do is to connect the sparrows and the humans together. So this is focusing on just one of those towns that we studied, one called Broken Hill. And in this case, what we did was looked at the association between the amount of lead in the blood of the sparrows across the horizontal here down the bottom, and the amount of lead, concentration of lead in the children. And what you see there is also a quite strong positive correlation. What that gives us is a way then of producing a mathematical description of the pattern between the two, and seeing if we can use that model, that mathematical model, to predict what could happen at a different town. So the key thing to One Health is, can you have some predictive value here? Can you say that the sparrows are truly a sentinel to what might be happening in the humans? So we took that model from the previous graph and used it to predict what would happen, what would we see in terms of human health and childhood blood in a different town if we caught birds in this different town. So this graph shows a really nice predictive correlation between the two things. So the sparrow blood is across the bottom, and then the y-axis is the childhood blood that we would predict to see, and it matches very well with the actual patterns that we see in the sparrows in a different town. So the mathematical model that you used in one town can then be used in another, only knowing the sparrow blood to then predict quite reliably what the childhood exposure to lead would be. So this sort of wraps that whole signal together to show that in this case, because sparrows are sedentary resident birds, and they're living in the same types of environments that children are playing in, they can be used as sentinels for human public health. This graph is showing what's called the isotope type of the different lead. And so if anyone's got any background in chemistry, Bill Williams might be following along with this one, given his master's in biology. What this is showing is that the type of lead that we find in sparrows is the same type of lead that we see in children. So it's not accidental or fortunate in some form that the sparrow blood correlates really well and can predict the children's blood. It's because it is actually the same type of lead that gets into the birds as gets into the people. So this sort of wraps up the whole story, showing that you can study the animals to have a predictive value of what's actually going to happen in terms of public health. So this gives another reason why you should be thinking about the health of the animals in the area, because it's very intimately connected to public health in this case. Now, the other case study I want to talk about is, can we approach this in terms of animals giving us an advantage in protecting us from infectious diseases? And in this case, I'll walk through an example that some of you might have even experienced. From about 25 or so years ago, the West Nile virus outbreak on the east coast of the US that swept from New York State across the Mississippi in just a matter of a couple of years. So emerging infectious diseases are unfortunately all around us. They are pretty much ever present. We've lived through a recent example of this with COVID. We are starting to live through an example with avian influenza. And as the climate warms and more diseases come up from the Caribbean area and North and South America, we will see more and more infectious diseases emerge in our area. Many of these infectious diseases are diseases of wildlife, but they spill over to affect humans. That kind of disease is called a zoonotic disease. And West Nile virus is an example of this, where the virus replicates in birds, is spread by a mosquito vector, so mosquitoes are biting birds, and then spreading the virus from one bird to another. The problem comes for human health when there's a lot of the virus in a particular area. Then there's a lot of mosquitoes who are carrying the virus. And so if a mosquito bites a person or another animal, there's a good chance that the virus will then spread to that unintended host. And this is the spillover effect. It's spilling over from the system that it normally operates in because the virus is replicating too much and then spilling over into the human population. And horses were also a consideration with West Nile virus. There was quite a lot of action that was taken to try to protect valuable horses in this outbreak in the early 2000s. Now, if you think about other infectious diseases that you might have heard of, many of them are zoonotic. Many of them replicate in wildlife and spill over to humans. Avian influenza is one. Lyme disease, which I'm sure, well, I hope everybody who does bird work in this area is well aware of. So that's a disease that spills over from the vector of ticks into humans. If there's so much of the Lyme disease causing agent in the area, then ticks are likely to have it. And if they bite you, then you have a chance of getting Lyme disease. Even famous diseases like the plague, bubonic plague, and anthrax, these are zoonotic diseases. Diseases of wildlife that spill over to humans. So how does this fit into One Health? There may be ecological solutions to trying to reduce the risk of these kinds of spreads of diseases, of these types of diseases anyway. And one that I want to focus on is called the dilution effect. And the dilution effect comes about if there are hosts. In this case, I'll sort of play it through with West Nile virus and think about birds as being the host of a virus. There are two different types: very effective hosts where the virus can replicate a lot, and ineffective hosts where the virus barely replicates or even doesn't survive from being inside that type of bird. So in a very effective host, what happens is that, in this case, a mosquito that has the virus bites a bird, then the virus starts to replicate inside the cells of the bird. And so you get lots and lots of copies of the virus. And if it replicates really, really quickly, then if another mosquito bites that bird, it's quite likely that it will pick up the virus and spread it to other birds and maybe even spill over to humans. So really effective hosts that replicate the virus a lot, but still survive long enough to be bitten by another mosquito, can be bad news for humans in this system. Ineffective hosts, so species of birds where the virus doesn't replicate very much or even deactivates within the bird, are protective, because if the virus enters through a mosquito into the bird and it doesn't replicate or it deactivates, then it's a dead end. And there'll be a slower spread of the virus throughout the whole population, fewer copies of the virus in the environment, much less risk to humans. So effectively, by having more ineffective dead-end hosts in an area, you are diluting down the amount of virus in the area and lowering the risks to humans of picking up the virus accidentally. So the dilution effect can work if you have a lot more ineffective species hosts than effective species hosts. In this case, we're going to think about West Nile virus, so species of birds in an area. If there's more ineffective hosts, there's less risk to humans. So in general, and this is the case with West Nile virus too as well, if most birds are ineffective hosts and only a few birds are really effective hosts, when you increase the diversity of an area, increase the number of species in the area, much more likely to be adding an ineffective host than an effective host. And so diversity, the pattern of diversity can lead to a dilution effect and proportionally more ineffective hosts than in a low diversity area. Now, this is especially true if we meet two particular conditions. One is that there are quite few species that are really effective viral copiers, really effective reservoir hosts for the disease-causing agent, the virus in this case. And if the hosts that tend to be really super effective viral copiers are associated with urban types of areas that have low diversity. So in the case of West Nile virus, does this happen? Can we meet these conditions? And then can we see whether bird diversity in an area actually protects us from catching West Nile virus. So in the case of West Nile virus, this is another sort of picture of the transmission pattern and processes for West Nile virus. Mosquitoes bite birds, and the virus goes between the mosquito vector and the bird host replicating. But if it gets too high, it spills over to things like humans and to horses. We know that there are dead-end hosts, such as human and horses. We also know that there are some dead-end hosts among the bird communities as well. There are some bird species that are not very effective hosts. We also know that there are some bird species that are very effective hosts. And you might have heard of some of these because of the effects on these bird populations back sort of 25 years ago. So crows were the ones that got most attention. We saw some crow die-offs when West Nile virus emerged in the early 2000s. Crows are probably the most effective host for the West Nile virus, replicating very quickly within crows. We know that many species of thrushes, including the American robin, is an effective host. Many species of finch, including the house finch, are effective hosts. And old world sparrows, again, coming back up to as well, are effective hosts. Now, all of these species are urban associated and tend to be found in lower diversity areas, areas where we see a lower species count in general. And the effective reservoir hosts, because they're associated with those lower diversity areas, effectively we can sort of use diversity as an indicator of the strength of this potential dilution effect that could protect humans from contracting West Nile virus. So we wanted to see whether, as West Nile virus emerged in those early 2000s, whether bird diversity could protect humans contracting West Nile virus. So West Nile virus, the first recorded case, was in New York State in 1999, in the US anyway. West Nile virus was endemic in North Africa. But it came to the US in the late 90s, the first record in 1999. But it spread very quickly. Between then and 2001, 2002, it had spread across all of the states east of the Mississippi. And it reached the Rockies pretty quickly too as well. So it jumped all the way across the country in just a couple more years after that. So this is a fast-moving, fast-spreading virus and affected lots of people and lots of animals. And the US spent a lot in public health combating that outbreak and also subsequently monitoring what's happening and still treating people and other animals, including domestic animals, for West Nile virus every year. So this was a serious public health concern at the time and is still continuing to be something that we spend significant time and attention on in terms of public health. Here's a map from the CDC. I got these maps a while ago. I'm not sure you can even get maps from the CDC currently. But the maps basically indicate how West Nile virus was spreading across the country, county by county in this case. So I'm going to focus on the analysis that I'll do, focus on all the states east of the Mississippi. The red-colored counties in this case are situations where there's a positive sample for West Nile virus in birds. So you can see as I click through these maps, you go from red in a smallish number of counties, concentrating in New York State and also in Florida in 2001, to boom in 2002, straight across the Mississippi, just to give you an idea of the strength of this outbreak. And then as you go to 2003, for some reason, the CDC changed its color palette from red to pink, but you still see it reaching across to the Rockies and the whole of California by 2004. Now, a lot of these, you might notice that there are a lot of sort of these yellow counties as you go into 2005. Those are basically counties that have stopped testing. And Virginia basically stopped testing around about 2005 because it felt the West Nile virus was just endemic by then. It was there. The birds had it, and they didn't want to spend any more money testing birds. So that's sort of implied that it's all still there. So it's really the front wave of this animation that you want to pay attention to. So what we wanted to look at was the real explosion from 2001 to 2002 to see whether bird diversity helped protect people as that explosion of this virus, of this disease, occurred across the eastern states of the US. So what we did was we looked at incidence of West Nile virus in situations where we could also get information about the bird diversity in the area, the proportion of various different effective hosts for West Nile virus, so the corvids, the thrushes, old world sparrows, and finches, and look to see whether those were predictors of the outbreak of West Nile virus. So to do this, we looked at pairwise comparisons of neighboring counties, because we also know that geography is going to be important for the spread of a disease. So we wanted to look at counties that were next to each other, because then the disease could easily spread from one to the other, and look at a county. All these counties that we studied were situations where there was confirmation of bird West Nile cases in those counties. But the colors that you see, blue and red, and you can use whatever political affiliation you want to decide which one is infected versus not infected for human cases. One color means that there was a human report of a case. The other color means there was not. So they're all paired as these little blue-red pairings. So there's bird cases, but there may not be a human case. And we want to look to see at the difference between those neighboring counties in terms of bird diversity. Is there greater bird diversity in the case where we don't see the human cases of the virus? So we compiled a lot of data for this, including breeding bird survey, which some of you might be involved in Virginia. Fantastic surveys every year, going back a long time, to look at bird diversity across this area. And in particular, we wanted to look to see whether the bird diversity before this outbreak, before it really started affecting the bird communities, was predictive of what would happen to the human population when this outbreak occurred. So we used the BBS data from 1998, because 1999 was the arrival year for West Nile, and compared it to the West Nile maps of 2002, when this epidemic really broke out across the eastern states. And we did this while also accounting for a few other things. Urbanization is an important metric here, and in particular, impervious land cover, which means hard surfaces that don't let water through. Now, the reason why we wanted to include that was because mosquitoes breed in small pools and puddles of water. So in general, with more impervious surface cover, you're going to get more mosquitoes. You probably all experienced that to a certain extent. So this was a sort of a proxy for the vector population, how many mosquitoes were likely to be in a county. And we also wanted to account for certain human demographic parameters. We know that certain types of people, age classes of people, are likely to be more susceptible to getting a disease. So whether you're very young or very old, and also socioeconomic status can be predictors of disease risk in some cases. So we also wanted to include that as potential explanatory factors in addition to the bird data. Now, what we found, this is sort of just a graphical representation of what we found. So looking at the various different predictors of what explains the spread of this human cases of West Nile virus. So the census data, the human census data, the urbanization pattern, which is a predictor of mosquitoes, and then various different bird data, including the general bird diversity, which is species richness, how many species there are in a county, and then the four sort of candidates of being potential super spreaders of the West Nile virus. And this is what we found. In general, the human census data was not a good predictor at all of who got West Nile or not. Neither were the number of thrushes and old world sparrows, house sparrows in an area. So none of those things influenced the spread of the disease as far as we could tell. Crows and finches did have an effect. So if there were more crows and if there were more finches, there was more likely to be a human case of West Nile virus in a county. So the size of these arrows is basically proportional to the effect size that we saw. So the biggest effect was with the crows, and that's what we predicted going in, because crows seem to be the most effective replicators of the virus. That made sense. Urbanization was also a positive predictor of human West Nile virus, and in a bigger way than both of the previous bird data. And that also makes more sense, because with more impervious surface cover, more little puddles and pools of water, more breeding ground for mosquitoes, more vector, more biting, more potential for spread of this virus, more human cases. So that also makes sense. The biggest predictor by far was bird diversity, and it was a negative relationship. So in other words, where there was more bird diversity, when there were more species of birds in a county, there were far fewer cases of human West Nile virus. So in other words, bird diversity is helping to protect us from getting a virus that replicates in those birds. Greater diversity, fewer cases of human West Nile. So in this case, bird diversity is a buffer, is a protector against people getting a disease, in this case, West Nile virus. And it's very consistent with the explanations of this dilution effect, which comes from the One Health literature. In this case, it's quite a staggering number. The bird diversity differences can explain up to 50% of the variation in the human cases of West Nile virus. Much better predictor than the human data itself in terms of susceptible populations. And that's showing the strength of the relationships between nature and human health, that up to 50% of this variation can be explained by bird diversity. Now, since we published that study quite a while ago, other people have looked at this and confirmed it in different areas of the world, including other parts of the US. And what we did was we combined all of those studies to look at what are these predictive mathematical models of understanding how bird diversity and West Nile virus are related to each other. So we could create a consensus equation, basically, of how bird diversity predicts risk to humans of contracting West Nile virus. And if you use that model, that new equation coming from several studies, what we can generally say is if you increase the species richness, in other words, the number of unique bird species in an area, just by one new species in an area, and as long as it's not one of those super spreader species of a corvid or a finch or a house sparrow or a thrush, you can have the potential of reducing about the risk of about 250 cases of human West Nile virus in a year. So some back of the envelope calculations about the public health cost of treating people with West Nile virus, including time off sick and time not being able to work, as well as the direct treatment for having the virus, you can come up with a calculation of how much it costs society to treat someone with West Nile virus. And what that means is that by conservation actions, by increasing your bird diversity in a county just by one species, in 1 year, you could save that county approximately $20 million. That's quite a lot of money when you start to add it up, and especially for the scale of things that we're talking about. So here's a direct argument for why investments in conservation that help bird diversity are directly important for society. It helps protect us against emerging diseases like West Nile virus. You can add in other viruses too as well, because as you improve an ecosystem, protect an ecosystem, you're likely going to be increasing mammal diversity too as well, in which case you can be protecting yourself against Lyme disease as well. So these things are cumulative as you start to think about multiple diseases. In this particular case, this is a nice example of birds buffering us against a disease that is replicating within those different species of birds. So we're currently starting to experience some issues to do with avian influenza. The avian influenza has been around for a while. We've had various different kinds of sort of levels of outbreaks and scares before, but the one that we're in right now seems more serious than the past. So avian influenza is another case where it's a disease that's replicating in animals, in this case birds. We know that there are effects on human health if it transfers over, and we know it's related to the environmental health too as well. These things are all related to each other in terms of a One Health paradigm. Avian flu is now being reported in close to 500 different bird species in the US. So it's in a lot of birds. It seems to replicate most in larger birds. Waterfowl have been a particular attention for a lot of people, and poultry. Probably less so in songbirds, in the passerines that we see. But I think there's some bias in the sampling of that because not that many passerines have really been tested. a lot of the testing has been done on waterfowl. There have already been several large-scale mortality events of birds. So we've had bird die-offs in the US and globally too as well. So that's worrying in terms of bird conservation, of course, when any kind of virus is decimating birds, as West Nile virus decimated a lot of crow populations. Recent outbreaks have also crossed over into domestic animals. So we know that more than 1,000 dairy herds have been infected with West Nile across many different states. We also know that probably more than this, but at least 160 million head of poultry have been killed because of West Nile. Largely, once West Nile has been detected in a large-scale poultry farm, they kill all the chickens. So a lot of domesticated animal production, food production systems are being affected by this too as well. And we also know that humans are getting this. So there's been 70 confirmed cases in the US, including a death earlier this year. So this is something we're at the beginning of, but it's something that I think, as people interested in birds and interacting with birds a lot, something that we should think about, because there may be things that we can do to slow the spread of this and the risks of avian influenza crossing over to humans, to spilling over to creating a human-based disease as well. So I have a few recommendations, and I shared this with the Williamsburg Bird Club and Master Naturalist down here too as well several weeks ago. One of them is to try to minimize interactions among wild birds and these food production systems with poultry and with cattle. So there are effective ways to try and keep birds away from cattle farms and poultry farms. Unfortunately, many of them are expensive and out of reach for most farmers in terms of either netting or different kinds of sound devices that could be effective. So part of what we can do is advocate for various different organizations, including the state, to help farmers protect their cattle and protect their chickens from interacting too much with birds, especially the birds that are more likely to be carrying avian influenza, so larger birds in general. One thing, this is my own pet theory, pun intended, is there could be a significant transfer risk from cats to people. So if cats are outdoor cats are very effective predators. They can even be very effective scavengers. It's quite likely an outdoor cat is going to interact with a bird in some way if it's outside for long enough, whether it catches the bird or not, or whether it just finds a dead bird or bird material. Because so many birds seem to be harboring the virus, there is a risk to your cat of contracting avian influenza from interacting with a bird. We know that cats are actually quite susceptible to the versions of the virus that are around right now. Some zoos have actually lost their wild cat, large cat collection because of avian influenza. So we know that the virus replicates quite well within cats. If that cat catches the virus from being outdoors and interacting with a bird, and the virus replicates a lot, it comes indoors and then snuggles with you, there is a risk of transfer. One more reason why you should keep your cats indoors, because the cats unfortunately could be a contact point, a transfer point between avian influenza outside in birds and then indoors with you. So just another thing to think about. And then probably the most important for many of us is, what do we do with things like bird feeders? So many of us maintain bird feeders and bird baths. We love attracting birds into certain areas and observing them and getting fairly close to them. And you're probably all very conscientious about your bird feeders and cleaning them and keeping them topped up with feed and everything, which is great. As you do this, be wary that you've had attracted birds in and they may have been carrying copies of the virus. There's probably a little lower risk with the songbirds than with the waterfowl and so on, but still there have been reports of many species of songbird carrying virus. So as you clean and maintain your bird feeders, I suggest wearing sort of standard PPE. Wear masks, wear gloves, keep yourself protected as much as you can. don't stop doing this, but just keep yourself protected in a sensible way, including your footwear. So when you are outside shuffling around in the seeds and stuff, and the stuff that birds will naturally drop on the ground around your bird feeders, don't traipse that back into the house. Leave those shoes outside. Wear different shoes for doing that compared with being inside the house. Just sort of take some sensible precautions. All of these types of things, if we do them now while it's early in this process, I believe can lower the risks for everybody of avian influenza becoming a human problem. We can be part of a solution before there's even a dramatic problem. And I think that's a good thing in terms of what people involved with birds can do. And I want to finish off for a few minutes just talking about the institute that I work with, the Institute for Integrative Conservation at William & Mary, and the type of work that we do, because what I've talked about is sort of typical for the ways in which we approach many different types of projects. So we're an institute that's focused on conservation, and I'm talking to the choir here in terms of conservation, especially in terms of bird conservation, but in broadly, the life on Earth, the biodiversity of Earth, gives society pretty much everything that it needs. It's food, it's clean air, it's clean water, it's textiles, it's building materials. The top 20 pharmaceuticals sold in the US are all derived from nature and then synthesized in pharmaceutical labs later, perhaps. But all of these things nature gives us. If we're losing life from Earth, we are losing the capacity to support fundamental aspects of human society. But unfortunately, we are losing nature at an alarming rate. We're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. What this graph shows is geological time. Geologists are a little funky. They count backwards. So the 0 is all the way to the right rather than to the left that we're normally sort of looking at. So all the way to the right over here, if you can see my cursor, is the current day, and it's going back in millions of years. What the spikes are showing are the mass extinctions in the geological record. It's showing what kind of proportion of the life on Earth is going extinct at particular times. This last one, number 5, the end Cretaceous one, is the one that's really famous because that's the one where the non-avian dinosaurs all went extinct. We still have dinosaurs because we have birds, but the non-avian dinosaurs all went extinct there. The steepness of all of these spikes is basically the extinction rate. Currently, there are some really good estimates to show that our current extinction rate is on par with the largest mass extinction the planet has ever seen, perhaps even faster. But we're at the earlier stages of it. We have time to slow it down. We have time to take action. And that's what the Institute for Integrated Conservation is all about, trying to slow down the loss of biodiversity from the planet, the loss of life from the planet. All of our ecosystems are basically the life support system for the Earth, including to sustain human life. So the way that we approach this through this infographic, in the middle of this infographic, we have humans and other parts of nature interacting with each other because we are part of nature. We're not separated from nature. And the way that we try to strengthen human-nature relationships and connections is by looking at it through the aspects of human well-being. So this circle around the outside is sort of a lens, a telescope that you're looking at the human-nature relationships with. So in here, we have human well-being, in other words, people's health, job opportunities, economic opportunities, and communities, meaning that local communities must be empowered to lead the local conservation action. Although you can think about conservation at a global scale, in large part, it gets enacted at a local scale, involving local people, many of you. And that's when it becomes really super effective, when local people are empowered to do things and the actions are greatly informed by local voices and local opinions. If we lose biodiversity, we lose so much for human society. More than half of just the economic activity on the planet is related to nature. If we lose nature, we lose tons of opportunities for people in the future. We're simply not reinvesting enough in the planet for a sustainable future. And that pattern must change. Otherwise, we will continue to lose biodiversity. So the way that we've tried to do this through the Institute for Integrative Conservation, or the IIC, is to think about a world in which humans and nature are intimately and inextricably connected, and that the natural environment persists and thrives for future generations. And we're doing this by trying to empower local communities, as I was mentioning, and all different kinds of thought leaders. Knowledge and expertise can live in many different forms. It doesn't have to be associated with people with PhDs at universities. It can be in very local people and what their knowledge of nature is, and come together to bring about solutions that actually work for people and for the planet at the same time. So what we're doing is we're building networks of partners. Several people mentioned networks of partners previously in some of your awards, which is great. So we have more than 100 global partners in this. So we work all around the world, and we're trying to grow a very diverse pool of talent that comes from all different kinds of backgrounds. This includes students at William & Mary, but also includes partners all around the world to look at place-based conservation led by local communities, because that is the most effective type of action that we can have on the ground. And so what this does, it connects various different forms of conservation knowledge with actual action. So the IIC is about trying to empower local communities in collaboration with partners and the university, William & Mary, to actually bring about change, to deliver solutions, not just think about them, not just study the problems, but to actually deliver improvements for everybody. So we do this through various different forms of education. We have a new undergraduate major and minor that's grown very quickly. The first that we can tell in integrative conservation, and some other universities are now starting to copy us, which is great. That's very solutions focused, really focused on delivering improvements for people, for communities, as well as for biodiversity, and engaging local communities to increase their capacities to lead for themselves. So we do a lot of training of local communities as well, so that they can continue work in various different ways. We also put on a lot of events, which is something that you might want to participate in too as well. Some online events, some in-person events at William & Mary that might be fun. Like last week, we had a really famous National Geographic photographer, Brian Scarry, come and give a fantastic talk on Earth Day. We send students around the world to try and do this with local communities. So here's just some examples from various different places from a couple of years ago that students went out to. This year, we're getting ready to send students to, just in a week or so, they'll be heading off to the Philippines, Nepal, Kenya, Uganda, to work with local community partners on various different scales of conservation problems. We also bring people to William & Mary. So this is an example of our capacity engagement, capacity development program called the Catalyst, where we, in our partnerships from around the world, we bring emerging leaders from those organizations to William & Mary for different types of inclusive leadership training. So this is an example of the cohort from a couple of years ago, representing, well, let me see, South Africa, Kenya, Philippines, Nepal, Mongolia in that picture. Partnerships from across the world. So you can be involved in this if you like to. One of the easiest things to do is to sign up to get information. So here's a link, and I think we're recording this, but we can also share these slides too as well, so you can have this information directly. To sign up for our listserv, and we put out announcements, especially about events all the time that you can participate in. All of our events are free to attend. So you welcome, no matter where you're from, to come participate in those. You could even suggest to us events that we could host. If you think about great speakers or great events that you would like to see happen through the IIC. You can also suggest partnerships for projects. I heard several, especially in the awards summaries, potentials for projects that we might be able to support and help with. And you can also directly help by sponsoring one of these students or a conservation project too as well, if you have a favorite or if you have something that you would like to be involved in. Many of them are bird related. So I want to wrap up there. I can leave you with this sort of information slide for a little bit. Here's some contact information. We're on some social media channels if you're into those types of things too as well, following on Instagram, mostly for the students because there's tons of photos and stuff like that, on LinkedIn, and also just from the website too as well. And my email address is there, and I'd be very happy to reply to anybody who has follow-up questions too as well. And with that, I think I will wrap up and stop my sharing.
Thank you so much, John. That was amazing for us to better understand this, how everything is integrated. We do have some questions for you that have come in the chat. The first one was, what wild bird species have had a large die-off from avian flu?
Largely, that's from what I've seen has been largely focused on waterfowl. Um, so there have been several species of waterfowl and gulls and terns that have been affected by um, avian influenza, as far as we know so far. It's easier to notice die-offs in these larger birds because you see the carcasses, and especially if they're colonial breeding types of birds, which many of these are, you notice that the colony is not doing well. I suspect that there may be other populations of birds that are being largely affected, but we're not noticing it yet, especially with small songbirds. I expect there is more effect, but we're just not sampling it because they're a bit more cryptic, a little bit harder to find dead birds and have them sampled. That's what I
Makes
suspect.
sense. Yeah, and Diane had a question about encouraging property owners to increase bird diversity on their own. Would that be a worthwhile effort?
Absolutely. And there are many NGOs that help with that to help various different kinds of properties, increase the bird friendliness of their properties, especially with grassland and tree management. Um, so I would say places like Audubon, American Bird Conservancy have really good materials there. Cornell have some good materials for sort of backyard improvements as well. Now, as we do this, especially if you do it around your properties, I think you should also consider window collisions as a potential risk. If you're knowingly attracting in lots of birds, make sure that you have thought about the safety of your windows as well, because we know that birds are quite prone to flying into glass, and that can be a problem. So there's a balancing act there, right? Um, but in general, especially if people own large amounts of property, maybe that existing farms or old farms, there are plenty of things that people can do to make them a bit more bird friendly.
Mm-hmm. And Tom asked, he actually commented that there's a movement in Australia to avoid the feeding of wild birds, and he was wondering if you second that. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, this is controversial, especially in this crowd, right? In terms of, because many of you probably invest in bird feeders. I've had many conversations about this. In certain parts of the country, including where I'm living in Williamsburg, in the spring and the summer, there may not be a net positive effect on supplementary bird feeding. As it gets towards fattening up for migration, there's probably more evidence that there's some benefit. Um, Over the winter, there may be some benefit too as well. In general, there's greater benefit in providing clean drinking water probably than supplementary food for birds. So I still think there's ways of attracting the birds in and enjoying them, enjoying their beauty, which is an important part of our interactions with nature. I don't want to underplay that, while still benefiting the birds too as well. There have been some scientists who've been much more hardcore about saying just don't feed the birds at all. Um, I'm not of that ilk, even though there are some studies to show that supplementary feeding can be a little detrimental to some species, because the supplementary feeding through bird feeders enhances people's enjoyment of birds. And we don't want to lose that, because ultimately, for many of these conservation issues, and especially the conservation solutions, we need people on our side. We need people to care. And if there's, some damages to birds, but it can increase the degree to which people care about birds. And in the US, a lot of people care about birds. A recent US Fish and Wildlife Service survey indicated that probably a third of all adult Americans spend money supporting birds every year. That's a lot of people. We don't want to lose that. We have a lot of people that we can mobilize.
Well, that ties into with Diane's next question because she said, what might be ways to increase public awareness of the animal-human health connection and the importance of diversity?
Yeah, I think that comes back onto sort of my house and working with media companies, working with publicity issues to put out information that helps people understand the interactions between birds and other forms of wildlife with humans and how you can have these very positive interactions that are helpful not only for the wildlife but also for the people as well. So we have been working on sort of short videos, informational materials, and because at its heart, William and Mary is an educational institution. Educating young people to then go out into the world with this knowledge, no matter what career track they follow, armed with little anecdotes and information about how supporting, in this case, birds, is a positive thing. It really is a win-win situation, both in so many cases. So education is really important. Education within universities. We're also starting to think about how do we get this into more middle schools and high schools as well to reach more people and to reach people at really influential ages. So if you can convince a middle schooler or a high schooler that this is important, it's going to be with them for the rest of their lives.
Makes perfect sense. Let's see. Nancy had the question, what is the mechanism that determines the degree of effectiveness of a species as a host of a virus?
That's a really good question. I wish I could answer it because I think it really varies on the virus. So viruses they're amazing things. They're a different form of life to any other form of life. They are dependent on having a host cell to actually replicate. So biologists even discuss whether a virus is truly alive or not, because it can't replicate by itself. It has to infiltrate something. And then it hijacks the cellular machinery of the host to replicate itself. And as it does that, it often combines the genetic material of the host and the virus itself. So it basically mutates and evolves at every single replication step in some form, or has a risk of doing. How it does that, the machinery, which is what the question is, it varies from virus to virus and host to host. So I couldn't pinpoint like a particular thing or a particular molecule or a particular aspect of a cell that says this is what makes it better. It really does vary by virus-host relationships. So different viruses replicate better in different hosts in general.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our questions, and I think we are about time to wrap up. Diane, would you like to close us out?
Absolutely. John, that was fabulous. I know every one of us learned a ton, and it when we talk about conservation and people who love birds and support conservation, that's kind of one segment of the world. But once you pull in that human health connection, that gets to way more people in terms of getting them concerned about conservation. And so I'm really excited about it. And we've got some maybe talking to do in the future, because I think the VSO would be really interested in helping to spread the word. You're talking to some of us as individuals about how we can help, and maybe the organization itself will have ways that we can sort of collaborate.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful to discuss. And there are other university collaborators. I mean, Eric Waters is on this call too as well, and I'm sure he would be a great partner in much of this work. He's done a bunch of disease ecology work too as well.
Yeah, conservation is our mission. And so this, that to me, it gives a whole nother angle to make a case for conservation. So a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much.